It started with the tracks. I'd been in Deadwood Pines for 3 days, parked at the edge of the forest in a gravel clearing barely wide enough for my RV. My plan was simple: set up trail cameras, follow wolf prints, and collect enough data to publish a paper on predator-prey dynamics. The forest was remote, untouched, perfect for what I needed. But the wolves weren't cooperating. I'd found the first set of prints on the second day. Clean, distinct paw marks that wove through the underbrush. They should have led me to a den or at least a scent post. Instead, they stopped abruptly in the middle of a clearing as if the animal had disappeared into thin air. The next set was worse. The paw prints started normally, deep and steady in the damp soil, but as I followed them, they changed. The tracks grew larger, the toes elongating, the pads splitting as if the wolf's feet were morphing into something else. The final prints were enormous, clawed impressions too big to belong to any predator I'd studied. Something wasn't right. The forest was unnervingly quiet. I've spent years in the wilderness, and I've learned to tune out the usual sounds: bird calls, rustling leaves, distant scurrying. But here, there was nothing. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin, and the silence seemed to amplify the sound of my own footsteps. That night, as I reviewed the footage from my trail cameras, I found nothing. No wolves, no deer, no small mammals, just static and the occasional flicker of motion too fast to identify. It was as if the forest had emptied itself. On the third night, I heard the scratching. It started faintly, just a soft scrape against the RV's side. I froze, listening, my fingers hovering over the keyboard of my laptop. The sound came again, louder this time, like claws dragging across metal. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the cool night air. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees beyond the clearing. Nothing. But when I circled back to the RV, I saw them. Deep gouges carved into the side panel, 4 long streaks that gleamed in the flashlight's glow. My stomach twisted. Whatever had made them wasn't small. The next day, I pushed deeper into the forest, determined to figure out what was going on. The tracks reappeared, leading me toward a dry riverbed littered with carcasses. The first was a deer, its body shredded beyond recognition. The kill was fresh, but no part of it had been eaten. Not the meat, not the organs. Nearby, a fox lay in a similar state, its throat torn open. Predators don't kill like this. Predators eat. I turned away, my gut churning. That's when I saw it. A charm hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. It was crude, made of bone and twine, with strange, spiraling symbols carved into its surface. I reached for it instinctively, but the moment my fingers brushed the bone, a wave of nausea washed over me. The air grew colder, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, a tall, gaunt figure with glowing red eyes. I spent the rest of the day in the RV, my hands shaking as I tried to write down what I'd seen. My logical mind fought against the rising fear, insisting that there was a rational explanation. But when night fell, the scratching returned. This time it was accompanied by a low growl, a sound so deep it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. The growl came from just outside the RV, circling the vehicle as the scratching grew more frantic. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, debating whether to confront whatever was out there. But before I could move, the growling stopped, replaced by a guttural, almost human laugh. The sound sent ice through my veins. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke, I ventured outside. The ground around the RV was covered in tracks, huge clawed impressions that circled the vehicle in erratic loops. I had to leave. But when I turned the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I cursed, popping the hood to find the problem. The battery cables had been severed, cleanly sliced as if by a blade. I wasn't alone out here. Desperation drove me back into the forest. If I couldn't drive out, I'd hike to the nearest road and flag someone down. But as I moved through the trees, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to move, flickering at the edges of my vision. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing. Then I saw it. The hunger. It stood at the edge of a clearing, its gaunt form silhouetted against the trees. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with matted fur clinging to its skeletal frame. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers tipped with claws that gleamed like obsidian. But its eyes were the worst. They glowed red, burning with an intelligence that sent a wave of primal fear through me. I stumbled back, tripping over a root as the creature stepped closer. It moved silently, its joints bending at unnatural angles. My flight instincts kicked in. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush as the hunger followed, its glowing eyes a constant presence behind me. The forest seemed to warp around me, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap me. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I found myself in a small makeshift shelter, a hunter's lean-to, long abandoned. Inside, I found a journal, its pages brittle with age. The entries were written in a frantic scrawl, describing a creature that matched the hunger perfectly. The writer claimed the only way to repel it was with fire and a refusal to give in to fear. The final entry read, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it out." The hunger's growl echoed through the trees, closer now. I grabbed a bundle of dry branches from the shelter and sprinted back toward the RV, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the clearing, I piled the wood into a circle and doused it with fuel from a spare canister. The hunger emerged from the tree line, its red eyes locked onto mine. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the hunt. With shaking hands, I lit a match and dropped it onto the fuel-soaked wood. The fire roared to life, casting long shadows across the clearing. The hunger recoiled, its gaunt form flickering like a mirage. I stood my ground, gripping a makeshift torch as the creature circled the flames. For a moment, I thought it would retreat, but then it lunged. The torch was my only defense. I swung it wildly, the flames licking at the creature's matted fur. The hunger let out a deafening screech, its skeletal frame convulsing as it backed away. Using the distraction, I scrambled into the RV and slammed the door shut. The engine sputtered but roared to life on the second try, and I peeled out of the clearing, leaving the fire and the hunger behind. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of it in the rearview mirror. A gaunt shadow standing at the edge of the firelight, its red eyes watching me leave. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. It's been weeks since I left Deadwood Pines, but the memory lingers. The hunger is still out there, stalking the forest, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander into its domain. And sometimes, late at night, I hear a low growl outside my window, and I wonder if it ever really let me go. The desert was alive with silence. That strange, heavy quiet you only find in places like Big Bend National Park, where the horizon stretches endlessly and the stars crowd the night sky. This was exactly what I'd come for. Big Bend wasn't just another stop for my travel column. It was a story waiting to be uncovered. I was here to solve the mystery of the Marfa lights. For decades, people have reported seeing strange orbs of light in the desert, glowing and flickering like lanterns. I didn't believe in ghosts or UFOs, but I did believe in a good headline. I wanted photos, a first-hand account, something definitive to debunk the legend. The truth, after all, was usually more interesting than the myth. I parked my RV on a stretch of remote desert, miles from the main campsite, set up my camera, and waited for night to fall. The first night, the lights didn't disappoint. Just after sunset, I saw them. 3 glowing orbs floating on the horizon. They hovered, flickered, and moved in ways that didn't make sense. Too erratic for headlights, too deliberate for a trick of the atmosphere. I started filming, heart pounding with excitement. "Got you," I muttered to myself, adjusting the lens. But as I watched, the lights shifted closer. They weren't just distant phenomena anymore. They were moving toward me. I felt a strange pull, like they were inviting me to follow. I stayed put, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. I chalked it up to the desert playing tricks. Big Bend was vast and empty, easy to feel like you weren't alone when you were. The next morning, I met Miguel. I'd driven to the park's visitor center for some background research and found him flipping through a field guide, his weathered face lined with years of desert sun. "You're out near the lights, aren't you?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah," I said, intrigued. "How'd you know?" He closed the book and gave me a long, measured look. "You look like someone chasing them." "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "People come here thinking they'll find answers. The lights aren't something you follow, amigo. They're something you avoid." "And why's that?" Miguel leaned closer, his voice low. "The lights aren't just lights. They're bait. They lure you in, and then they take you." I laughed it off, of course. I wasn't here to get spooked by campfire stories. But later that day, when I met Leah, I found myself repeating Miguel's words. She was setting up her telescope near a trailhead, her gear scattered across a patch of rocky ground. She had the air of someone who belonged here, relaxed, curious, and completely at home under the vast Texas sky. "Marfa lights," she guessed when she noticed my camera gear. "Guilty," I said. "What about you?" "Stargazing," she said, then added with a grin, "and maybe a little light chasing." I told her about Miguel's warning, expecting her to laugh. Instead, her expression grew serious. "Locals say the lights aren't just a phenomenon," she said. "They say they react to people. The closer you get, the more dangerous they become." "You believe that?" I asked. "I believe the desert has its secrets," she said. "You don't always have to understand something to respect it." That night, the lights returned. Brighter this time, closer. They moved with purpose, darting and weaving like fireflies. I filmed for hours, completely absorbed, until my weather radio crackled with static. I ignored it at first, but then I heard something faint through the interference. "Caleb." I froze. It was my voice, distorted, distant, but unmistakable. "Caleb, come closer." I grabbed the radio, fiddling with the dials, but the static only grew louder. My heart raced as I stepped outside, scanning the desert with my flashlight. The lights hovered in the distance, glowing faintly, almost waiting. Then I heard it again. "Caleb." This time the voice came from the direction of the lights. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I took a step forward, then stopped. Miguel's words echoed in my mind. They're bait. I backed away, locking the RV door behind me. The next morning, I found Miguel near a canyon overlook. I told him about the radio, the voice, the way the lights seemed to move with intention. "They've marked you," he said grimly. "Marked me?" I asked, trying not to scoff. "What does that even mean?" Miguel sighed, rubbing the brim of his hat. "The lights aren't just a trick of the eye. They're spirits, or something like it. They lure people out into the desert, and once you're lost, they take you. You're not the first." I wanted to dismiss him, but something about his tone unsettled me. He wasn't trying to scare me, he was warning me. That night, I made my biggest mistake. The lights were closer than ever, dancing just beyond the ridge. I couldn't resist. Against every instinct, I grabbed my flashlight and camera and followed. The desert felt different away from the RV. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. The lights led me over rocky terrain, always staying just out of reach. I kept going, convinced I was on the verge of a breakthrough. Then I saw the shadow. It was faint at first, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. But as the lights moved, the shadow grew more defined. Humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. My flashlight flickered. The shadow turned toward me, and I froze. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, a black emptiness that seemed to swallow the light. "Caleb," it whispered. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The lights pulsed, their glow searing into my eyes. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and twisting as if it were trying to take shape. "Caleb." I turned and ran, the whispers following me. The desert blurred around me, the landscape twisting in impossible ways. Every time I looked back, the shadow was there, closer, its outline flickering like a dying flame. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. When I slammed the door shut and locked it, the lights were still outside, hovering like sentinels. The shadow was gone, but the memory of its empty face lingered. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. It wasn't mine anymore. "Come back." I left Big Bend at dawn, the lights still flickering on the horizon. Miguel was right. The desert has its secrets, and some of them aren't meant to be uncovered. When I reviewed the footage later, most of it was distorted. But in one frame, I saw the shadow, standing among the lights, its empty face turned toward the camera. I don't know what I saw in Big Bend. Maybe it was just a trick of the desert, a mirage born of heat and exhaustion. Or maybe it was something else, something that defies explanation. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the lights again. And in the darkness, I hear the voice. "Caleb." The lake pulled at me from the moment I arrived. Lake Merine was supposed to be a fresh start. A seasonal caretaker job at a remote campground sounded like exactly what I needed. Steady work, isolation, and a chance to finally quiet the noise in my head. The moment I stepped out of my RV, though, I knew there was something different about this place. The water was too still, the air too silent, as if the entire lake was holding its breath. I spent my first few days adjusting to the routine, checking campsites, repairing broken picnic tables, and keeping the paths clear. It wasn't hard work, but the quiet got to me. Every time I stopped moving, I'd catch myself staring at the lake. It was beautiful, sure, clear enough to see the smooth rocks at the bottom near the shore. But it had a weight to it, a presence I couldn't ignore. The locals had warned me before I started. "Stay away from the water after dark," the old woman at the bait shop had said, her eyes narrowing as she handed me my supplies. "The lake keeps secrets." I'd laughed it off at the time. Now I wasn't so sure. The first night, I woke up to the sound of splashing. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The RV was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon outside. I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon, but the splashing didn't sound like an animal. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone treading water. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the stars. But as I scanned the shore with the flashlight, I saw ripples moving outward, as if something had just submerged. My heart thudded in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing. I stood there for a long moment, shivering, before retreating to the safety of the RV. By the second day, the lake was beginning to feel less like a feature of the campground and more like a living thing. I found myself drawn to it despite my unease, walking the shoreline during breaks and watching the way the light danced on its surface. That's when I found the first object. It was a child's toy, a small wooden boat, its paint faded and peeling. It had washed up on the shore near a cluster of reeds, and when I picked it up, it was damp and cold, like it had just come from the depths. I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong there. That night, the splashing returned. This time, I stayed inside the RV, listening as the rhythmic sound came and went. When I woke the next morning, I found wet footprints leading from the water to my RV and back again. My stomach dropped. The prints were human, barefoot, with long, narrow toes, and they stopped just short of the RV's door. The third day, I found the locket. It was tangled in a pile of driftwood near the southern edge of the lake, its chain rusted and its silver pendant tarnished. Inside was a photograph of a woman and a child, their faces faded but still visible. The child looked familiar, too familiar. I stared at the photo, my hands trembling. It wasn't possible, but the boy in the locket looked exactly like me at 5 years old. That night, the dream started. I was underwater, the cold pressing against my skin like a living thing. Around me, the ruins of a town loomed. Broken buildings, crumbled streets, and a church steeple jutting out of the silt like a skeletal finger. Figures moved in the shadows, their forms pale and distorted by the water. When I woke, my sheets were damp, and the sound of whispers filled the RV. "Caleb!" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside the window. Slowly, I turned my head, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures stood at the water's edge, their forms pale and waterlogged. They didn't move, but their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, locked onto me through the glass. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a soft, insistent plea. "Caleb, come back." By morning, they were gone, but the footprints remained, leading from the shore to the RV and back again. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and drive away, but I couldn't shake the pull of the lake. There were answers here, buried beneath the water, and I needed to know what they were. The journal I found in the old campground office shed was the final piece of the puzzle. It belonged to a caretaker from decades ago, filled with neat handwriting and sketches of the lake. One entry stood out. The lake was a town once before they flooded it for the dam. Not everyone left. Some stayed, thinking they could outlast the water. they didn't. And now they're still here, waiting for someone to bring them back. The entry ended with a single line scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Don't take what's theirs." That night, I found myself standing at the shore, the locket clenched in my hand. I didn't remember leaving the RV, but the cold air told me I'd been out there for a while. The drowned ones were waiting for me. They stood waist deep in the water, their pale forms swaying gently as if moved by an unseen current. Their eyes, or the absence of them, gleamed faintly in the moonlight. One of them raised a hand, pointing to the lake's center. "Return it," the whispers said. The locket felt impossibly heavy in my hand, its metal cold and unyielding. I nodded, my body moving on its own, and waded into the water. The cold was overwhelming, seeping into my bones as I swam toward the ruins. The lake floor sloped steeply, the water darkening as I descended. Soon, the shadows of the town began to emerge. The outlines of buildings, the crumbled remains of streets, and the spire of the church, half buried in silt. The drowned ones surrounded me, their forms flickering like ghosts. At the base of the church, I found an altar, its surface etched with strange, spiraling symbols. The whispers guided my hand as I placed the locket on the stone. The water stilled. The drowned ones faded, their forms dissolving into the darkness. For the first time in days, the lake was silent. When I surfaced, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the lake lifted. I stumbled back to the RV, shivering but alive. As I dried off and crawled into bed, a faint ripple spread across the lake, the last remnants of the drowned ones disappearing into the depths. I stayed for the rest of the season, my fear of the lake replaced by a strange sense of peace. At night, I sometimes heard faint splashes and whispers, but they felt distant, like echoes from a dream. The locket, the footprints, the visions, they were real. And they were gone now, laid to rest beneath the water. But every time I look at the lake, I feel their eyes watching me, waiting for the next traveler who dares to disturb their secrets. When Sam and I set off for Shadow Lake, I thought it would be just another trip, a break from city life and a chance to test my new nature tracking app. I'd spent months developing it, and this remote slice of Tahoe National Forest was the perfect proving ground. Sam, my best friend from childhood, had agreed to tag along for old time's sake. We hadn't done anything like this in years. The drive into the forest was rough. The trail to the lake wasn't marked on any maps, but that was part of the appeal. The fewer people who knew about it, the better. By the time we reached the site, the sun was sinking, casting long shadows over the still water. "Man, this place is unreal," Sam said, stepping out of the RV. "It's like a mirror." He wasn't wrong. Shadow Lake lived up to its name. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky and trees so clearly it was hard to tell where reality ended and the reflection began. But as I set up camp, something about the lake unsettled me. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. "It's just a lake," I told myself. But that night, it became much more. It started small. As Sam and I sat by the fire, I noticed how the lake mirrored the stars perfectly. But every so often, something didn't align, like the stars in the water moved before the ones in the sky. I dismissed it as a trick of the eye. Sam, ever the optimist, was enthralled. "You should post about this," he said, gesturing toward the lake. "This place would go viral." "Maybe," I replied, focusing on my app. It had been glitching all day, tracking animals and strange patterns. One marker suggested a bear had walked across the lake itself. Another recorded a sudden spike in movement near our camp, but when I checked, nothing was there. "Just bugs," I muttered, shutting it off. As the fire burned low, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned toward the lake and froze. My reflection wasn't sitting. It was standing, staring back at me. "Sam," I whispered, my voice tight. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze, frowning. "See what?" The reflection sat down, perfectly mirroring me again. My heart pounded as I forced a laugh. "Never mind." The next day, we hiked around the lake, marking trails and testing the app. The terrain was rugged, the kind of forest that feels untouched, but every path we took seemed to loop back to the water. By late afternoon, we encountered Claire, a park ranger who seemed to materialize from the woods. "Didn't think I'd see anyone out here," she said, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat. "Shadow Lake isn't exactly popular." "That's the point," I said, trying to get away from it all. She studied us for a moment. "You know the stories about this place?" "Stories?" Sam asked. Claire hesitated. "People say the lake reflects more than it should, that it takes something from you if you're not careful. Don't stare too long." I raised an eyebrow. "You actually believe that?" She gave me a hard look. "I believe enough to leave it alone. You should too." Then she was gone, disappearing into the trees as quickly as she'd appeared. That night, the lake came alive. I woke to the sound of voices, soft, indistinct whispers coming from the water. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees, but the sound wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the lake. "Evan." The voice was faint, but familiar. I swung the flashlight across the water, but the surface remained perfectly still. No ripples, no movement. Then I saw it. My reflection, standing again, its head tilted as if watching me. It raised a hand, pointing toward the center of the lake. "Evan, come closer." The voice wasn't mine, but it came from the reflection. My chest tightened as I stumbled back toward the RV. The next morning, I told Sam what I'd seen. He laughed it off at first, but his expression changed when I mentioned the voice. "I heard something, too," he admitted. "Last night, while I was walking by the shore. It sounded like my mom." His mom had passed away 5 years ago. I didn't know what to say. "You think it's just our minds playing tricks?" he asked. "Maybe," I lied. "Or maybe Claire got in our heads." The following day, Sam became distant. He spent hours by the lake, staring into the water. When I tried to talk to him, he brushed me off, saying he needed some space. That evening, as I reviewed the app's data, it started glitching again. A new marker appeared near the lake's center, labeled "You Belong Here." My stomach churned as I checked the other logs. Each entry was distorted, the map overlay now showing warped symbols and text that didn't make sense. I stepped outside to confront Sam, but froze when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the lake, his reflection perfectly still. It didn't mimic his movements. It just stared at him, smiling faintly. "Sam!" I shouted, running toward him. He didn't turn. "I can hear them," he said, his voice flat. "They're trying to tell me something." I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We need to leave. Now." But as I dragged him away, the lake rippled. Shadows moved beneath the surface, shapes that were almost human. That night was chaos. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around the RV. The lights flickered, and the app began to malfunction completely, displaying a looping message. Look closer. At some point, Sam left the RV. I woke to find his bed empty and the door open. Panic surged as I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the lake. He was standing waist deep in the water, staring at his reflection, which smiled back at him. "Sam, get out of there," I shouted. He turned slowly, his eyes glassy. "I can't. They need me." His reflection didn't turn. It just stood there, watching me, its expression cold and alien. I waded into the water, grabbing him by the shoulders. "You're not listening to them. You're listening to me." The shadows beneath the surface surged upward, taking form. They were humanoid but twisted, their faces empty voids, their hands reaching for us. In desperation, I remembered Claire's warning. I grabbed the camera from my bag and smashed the mirrored lens against a rock, throwing the shards into the lake. The spirits recoiled, their distorted shapes rippling as they dissolved into the water. Sam collapsed into my arms, trembling. The whispers faded, and the lake became still again. We left Shadow Lake at dawn, neither of us speaking as the RV bumped along the dirt road. Sam stared out the window, his face pale and drawn, while I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. As we pulled onto the main road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the lake in the distance and my reflection staring back at me. It smiled. The forest had a way of making you feel like you didn't belong. I parked my RV at the edge of a clearing in Coconino National Forest, Arizona. The light was fading, and the massive ponderosa pines cast long shadows across the campsite. I killed the engine, and the silence pressed in. No cars, no voices, not even the buzz of insects. Just the muted rustle of the trees swaying in the evening breeze. This was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no people, just me and my camera. I'd been chasing solitude for months now, moving from one national forest to another, trying to photograph something extraordinary. The truth was, I needed the work. My wildlife photography blog was drying up, my audience dwindling. This trip wasn't just about rediscovering my passion, it was about survival. But as I stepped out of the RV, setting up camp in the fading light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started small, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a flicker of movement in the tree line. I dismissed it as paranoia or maybe an animal curious about the newcomer. By the time I'd unpacked my gear and set up my tripod, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The first hour passed uneventfully. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet I'd expected. I photographed the rising moon, the gnarled silhouettes of trees, and the scattering of stars overhead. But then, as I adjusted my camera to capture the Milky Way, something moved at the edge of the clearing. I froze, peering into the darkness. My flashlight was inside the RV, and the only light came from my camera's LCD screen. Slowly, I scanned the tree line, but whatever had been there was gone. A trick of the shadows, I told myself. I was alone out here. I'd made sure of it. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was beautiful in daylight, its towering trees casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was cool, and the pine scent was sharp and clean. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods, hoping to find signs of wildlife, a deer, maybe even a fox. Instead, I found the tracks. At first, I thought that they were human footprints, but the proportions were wrong. The toes were too long, the heels too deep. And there were no boot treads, just bare, impossibly large feet. They led away from the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I crouched down, running my fingers over the imprint in the dirt. They couldn't have been more than a day old. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Something cracked in the distance, a sharp, deliberate sound like a branch snapping underfoot. I stood quickly, my pulse racing. "Hello?" I called, my voice ringing out in the stillness. No answer, just the echo of my own voice. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV felt too small, too exposed. I lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound beyond the thin walls. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the RV. My breath caught as I sat up, straining to hear. The steps paused near the door, then moved toward the back, the crunch of pine needles and dirt deafening in the stillness. Grabbing my flashlight, I moved to the window, my heart hammered as I pulled the curtain aside. For a moment, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A figure stood among the trees, motionless. It was tall, its shape obscured by shadow, but there was something wrong about it. Its proportions were off, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, heavy and unblinking, fixed on me. I stumbled back, the curtain falling shut. My mind raced. It had to be another camper, someone playing a prank. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The figure didn't belong. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. Maybe I was just overtired, my imagination filling the gaps left by isolation. I packed my gear and decided to move to a new spot, deeper into the forest. But as I drove, something felt off. The forest seemed denser, the roads narrower, the turns unfamiliar. I checked my GPS, but it was useless. No signal, no map, just a blinking dot in the middle of nowhere. After an hour, I found myself back at the same clearing. My stomach twisted as I parked the RV. I hadn't turned around. I'd followed the road straight. And yet, here I was, staring at the same trees, the same broken fire pit, the same clearing where the figure had stood. That night, the noises started again. At first, it was faint, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But as the hours passed, it grew louder. Footsteps circled the RV, faster this time, heavier. I locked the doors, my flashlight clutched tightly in one hand, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Then came the tapping. It started at the back window, a soft, rhythmic knock that sent shivers down my spine. Slowly, I moved to the window, my flashlight trembling in my grip. I pulled the curtain aside. The figure was there. It stood inches from the glass, its face obscured by shadow. Its hand rested against the window, long fingers splayed. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, slowly, it tilted its head, as if studying me. I dropped the flashlight and stumbled back, the beam casting wild arcs across the RV. By the time I picked it up and turned back, the figure was gone. I decided to leave at first light. I didn't care about the photos or the forest. I just wanted out. But when I started the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, my hands shaking, but the battery was dead. Panic set in as I grabbed my pack and set off on foot. I didn't care where the road led as long as it took me away from the clearing. The forest seemed alive now, the trees pressing in, their shadows shifting unnaturally. I wasn't alone. The figures appeared on either side of the road, standing silently among the trees. There were more of them now, 5, maybe 6. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, their shapes blurring at the edges like smoke. I ran. The road twisted and turned, but the figures were always there, just out of reach, their empty gazes following me. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest. When I finally stumbled onto a paved road, a ranger's truck pulled up beside me. The man inside looked at me with a mix of concern and suspicion. "You okay, buddy?" he asked. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, ridiculous. He offered me a ride back to the main ranger station, and I accepted, leaving my RV behind. As we drove, I glanced back at the forest. The figures stood at the tree line, motionless, watching. I never went back for the RV. I told myself it wasn't worth the risk, but the truth was, I couldn't face that forest again. Even now, miles away, I feel their eyes on me in the quiet moments, their presence lingering at the edges of my vision. The watchers are still out there, and I don't think they'll ever let me forget. The Badlands felt like the edge of the world, a jagged wasteland of shadow and light that stretched endlessly into the horizon. I had driven my RV deep into the heart of the park, chasing solitude and the perfect shot of the Milky Way. For years, my travel blog had been my life, a mixture of starlit landscapes and campfire tales. But lately, my inspiration had been drying up, my posts losing traction. I needed something extraordinary, something to reignite the spark. I thought the Badlands would give me that, a sky so vast and dark that the stars felt infinite. Instead, I found the light. It began, innocently enough, a faint glow on the horizon as I stepped out of the RV to set up my camera. I thought it was a distant fire or perhaps the headlights of an unseen vehicle. But as the night deepened, the light remained steady, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. It wasn't fire, it wasn't headlights, it was something else. I couldn't ignore it. The first photos I took of the night sky turned out beautifully, but my eyes kept drifting to that faint glow. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before, too consistent, too alive. Finally, I pointed my camera toward it, snapping a long exposure. When the image appeared on my screen, I froze. It wasn't just a glow. The light seemed to rise from the ground in a vertical beam, shimmering faintly, its edges blurred as though it were pushing through the fabric of reality itself. And within the light, I swore I saw movement. Dark shapes, half-formed and indistinct like shadows struggling to take shape. The hum started then. Low, resonant, barely audible, but deep enough that I felt it in my chest. I stood there, staring at the light, my camera hanging loosely in my hands. The hum synced with the pulsing glow, steady and deliberate, as if calling out to me. I should have stayed in the RV. I should have turned off my camera, crawled into my bed, and ignored it. But I didn't. I grabbed my pack, flashlight, and a bottle of water and set off into the night. The light was far off, nestled deep in the Badlands, and the terrain was unforgiving. The crumbling earth shifted beneath my boots, and the jagged rock formations loomed like silent sentinels. The hum grew louder as I walked, its rhythm steady, pulling me forward. The hike was grueling, disorienting. Landmarks I thought I recognized seemed to shift when I looked away, and the stars above felt distant, their light swallowed by the vastness of the void. I checked my watch once, only to realize hours had passed when it felt like minutes. Or was it the other way around? Time felt slippery here, unreliable, and still the light grew brighter. I reached the edge of a canyon just before dawn. The light pulsed from its depths, illuminating the jagged walls in unnatural hues. As I peered over the edge, I saw them. The symbols. They were carved into the canyon walls, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to hum with their own energy. They glowed faintly, their patterns shifting and pulsing in time with the light. I couldn't look at them for too long without feeling dizzy, as if they were reaching into my mind and twisting something deep inside. My flashlight flickered, then went out. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the canyon, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. Whispers filled the air, low, guttural murmurs in a language I didn't understand. My breath quickened as I spun around, the shadows seeming to close in. And then I saw it. A figure stood on the opposite edge of the canyon, silhouetted against the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and its proportions wrong. Its head tilted as it looked at me, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze, heavy and suffocating. Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the light. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if it were commanding me to follow. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic chorus that seemed to emanate from the canyon itself. I stepped back, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. This isn't real." The figure took a step forward, and the ground beneath me shuddered. I turned and ran. I don't remember how long I ran, only that the terrain blurred around me, the landscape twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The light followed, its pulse steady, its hum vibrating through my chest. When I finally collapsed, gasping for breath, I realized I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. This time it was closer, its shape clearer. Its skin, or what passed for it, shimmered like liquid, its surface rippling with each pulse of the light. And its face was a void, a blank space that seemed to absorb the world around it. "Why are you here?" a voice echoed in my mind. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I don't know," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, the void of its face expanding, and suddenly I was falling, not physically but mentally, as if it were pulling me into the depths of its being. Memories surfaced unbidden, the loneliness of the past year, the nights spent staring at my laptop, the constant fear that my work was meaningless. "You seek," the voice said, its tone cold and alien, "but you are not ready." The world shifted again, and I found myself standing at the base of the canyon. The light towered above me, brighter and more vivid than before. The symbols on the walls glowed fiercely, their patterns writhing like living things. And then I saw them. The shadows within the light were no longer vague shapes. They were beings, tall and distorted, their forms shifting with every pulse. They moved with a strange rhythm, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. One of them turned, its head tilting toward me, and I felt my knees buckle under its gaze. "You do not belong," the voice echoed, and the light surged, engulfing me in its brilliance. When I woke, I was back in the RV. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and the hum was gone. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a vivid, horrifying dream. But as I sat up, my camera tumbled from my lap, its strap tangled around my wrist. I hesitated, then turned it on. The photos were still there. The early images showed the canyon, the symbols, the faint glow of the light. But as I scrolled, the pictures changed. The figures were there, their distorted shapes frozen in motion. One image showed one of them reaching toward the camera, its void-like face inches from the lens. The last photo was the worst. It was of me. I was standing in the canyon, bathed in the light, my eyes wide with terror. But something was wrong. My shadow. It wasn't mine. It was taller, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. I left the Badlands that day, driving for hours without stopping. But even now, miles away, I can feel the light. Sometimes, when the world is quiet, I hear the faint hum, vibrating through my bones, and in the corner of my vision I see shadows moving, always just out of reach. The beacon still calls, and I'm afraid one day I'll answer. The air in Superior National Forest was sharp and cold, cutting through the thin layers of my jacket like a knife. The snow wasn't falling yet, but the sky promised it would. I'd chosen this trip to test my gear, a trial run for the solo winter expedition I'd been planning for years. This forest was vast, remote, and, most importantly, silent. Perfect for a test. Or so I thought. My RV sat nestled at the edge of a clearing, its heater humming quietly. I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and adjusted the pack on my back. The forest loomed around me, dark and dense, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. My father would have loved this. He'd always said the forest had a heartbeat if you listened close enough. I thought about him often during trips like this, especially now that he was gone. His voice still lived in my head. Stay sharp, trust your instincts, and don't let your pride get you killed. The hidden cabin. The first few hours were routine. I trekked through the trees, testing my navigation skills and marking potential spots for future campsites. The GPS worked fine, but I'd brought a compass as backup. The forest, while intimidating, was predictable in its layout. Or so it seemed. By mid-afternoon, I came across something unexpected. A cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden walls gray with age, the roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. I pulled out my map, scanning for any sign of man-made structures. There was nothing. No ranger station, no hunting shack, just trees and empty wilderness. Curiosity pulled me forward. The cabin was smaller than I expected, barely more than a single room, its door hanging slightly ajar. I hesitated, my instincts whispering that something about this was off. But my curiosity won. It always did. Inside, the air was colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rot. A broken chair sat in one corner, a rusted lantern in another. The walls were covered in scratches, strange symbols carved deep into the wood. I ran my fingers over one, a spiral, its grooves uneven but deliberate. On a table, I found a child's shoe, a cracked pocket watch, and an old journal. The leather cover was brittle, its pages yellowed. The handwriting inside was frantic, the words rambling and incoherent. They watch me. The shadows. They're in the trees. They're in the cabin. They're everywhere. I closed the journal, a chill creeping down my spine. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the door on its hinges. I left the cabin quickly, telling myself it was just an old building, nothing more. Strange sounds. That night, back at the RV, the forest felt different. The heater hummed steadily, and the glow of the lantern cast long shadows across the interior. I tried to distract myself by going over my notes, mapping out tomorrow's route. But then I heard it. A faint knock. I froze, the pen in my hand hovering above the page. The knock came again, louder this time. It was deliberate, coming from the back of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, the cold night air biting at my face. The forest stared back, empty and silent. There was nothing there. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing with the flashlight. My breath fogged in the air, and the only sound was the crunch of frost under my boots. Then I heard it again. Not a knock this time, but a creak, like floorboards shifting under weight. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the cabin. The shadows appear. I should have stayed in the RV. I should have locked the door and ignored it. But instead, I found myself standing in front of the cabin, my flashlight beam trembling against the wooden walls. The door swung slightly in the wind, its hinges groaning. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I stepped inside, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The symbols on the walls were glowing faintly, their edges pulsating like embers. And then I saw them. At first, they were just flickers, movements in the corners of my vision. But as I turned, I saw their forms clearly. Shadows, humanoid but wrong. They flickered like flames, their shapes shifting and bending unnaturally. They didn't have faces, but I felt their eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The shadows didn't move closer, but they didn't retreat either. They just stood there, watching. The forest turns against me. I don't remember running back to the RV, but I must have. My hands were shaking as I slammed the door shut and locked it. The heater hummed louder than before, the sound almost deafening in the silence. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself it wasn't real, that I was just tired. But then the knocking started again. This time it came from all sides. The walls of the RV groaned under the weight of something unseen, and shadows flickered across the windows, even though there was no light outside. I grabbed my pack, stuffing it with essentials. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, to get back to the main road and as far from this place as possible. But when I tried to start the engine, it sputtered and died. I tried again, but it was no use. The RV wasn't going anywhere. The shadows were closing in. The cabin secret. With no other choice, I grabbed my flashlight and ran back toward the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, carrying faint whispers that I couldn't understand. The shadows followed, their forms flickering between the trees, always just out of reach. When I reached the cabin, I barricaded myself inside, my flashlight beam darting across the room. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter now, casting the space in an eerie, pulsing light. My eyes landed on the journal still sitting on the table. Flipping through the pages, I found a sketch of a trapdoor. The drawing matched the floorboards in the corner of the cabin. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop, but I pried the boards open. The stench hit me first, earthy and rotten. Inside the root cellar, skeletal remains were piled haphazardly, their bones etched with the same glowing symbols as the walls. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows began to pour in, their forms twisting and coiling around the room. courage and sacrifice. The symbols. They had to mean something. The journal had mentioned fire, a way to cleanse the shadows. With trembling hands, I grabbed the lantern from the corner and smashed it against the floor. The oil spilled across the wood, igniting instantly. Flames roared to life, licking up the walls and illuminating the shadows in sharp relief. They writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into the smoke. The heat was intense, the air thick with ash and the stench of burning wood, but I forced myself to stay until the flames consumed the cabin. When I finally stumbled out into the night, the forest was silent. The shadows were gone. Escape. The RV started on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove away, the glow of the fire fading in my rearview mirror. The forest stretched endlessly around me, dark and still. I drove until the sun rose, the golden light chasing away the lingering darkness in my mind. Ending. I never told anyone what happened in Superior National Forest. I don't think anyone would believe me. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the faint creak of floorboards and see shadows flickering at the edges of my vision. The forest let me go, but I know it hasn't forgotten. Death Valley stretched endlessly before me, a desolate expanse of cracked earth and jagged peaks. The air shimmered with heat, warping the horizon, and the silence pressed in like a weight. This wasn't my first solo trip into a harsh landscape, but something about this place felt different, alive, in a way I couldn't explain. I'd come to Death Valley to study the infamous moving rocks of Racetrack Playa. For decades, scientists debated how these stones carved long trails in the dry lake bed without any apparent force. Recent research suggested a mix of ice and wind, but I wasn't satisfied. I wanted definitive proof, something no one else had captured. More than that, I needed this discovery to reignite my career and maybe my sense of purpose. My RV, my lifeline, was parked just off the main dirt road. I'd outfitted it with everything I'd need for the week: food, water, a backup generator, and enough equipment to study the rocks from every angle. I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. The first day on the playa was uneventful, if exhausting. The sun was merciless, turning the ground into a brittle skillet. I spent hours photographing the rocks and their trails, setting up time-lapse cameras and taking measurements. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and the barren beauty of the desert gave way to something eerie. I stood at the edge of the playa, staring at the endless expanse of cracked mud. The shadows of the mountains stretched long and dark, the silence absolute. That's when I saw it, a faint shimmer in the distance like heat rising from the ground. It looked like a person. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. The figure wavered, translucent, then disappeared as the last light faded. Just a mirage, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the unease lingered as I headed back to the RV. The next morning, I returned to the playa early, eager to review my data. To my frustration, several of the rocks had shifted overnight, leaving new, erratic trails that crisscrossed the lake bed. My cameras, carefully positioned to capture any movement, showed nothing but empty frames. I frowned, running my hand over one of the trails. The rocks weren't supposed to move like this, not without wind or ice. The patterns were too chaotic, as if the stones had been dragged by something unseen. Maybe I miscalculated, I muttered. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The day grew hotter, the air shimmering like molten glass. As I hiked further into the playa, I spotted it again. The figure. This time it was clearer. A woman, her outline flickering like a candle flame. She stood motionless, far off in the distance. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. She didn't move. I started toward her, my boots crunching against the brittle ground. But no matter how far I walked, the distance between us stayed the same. The heat pressed down on me, sweat soaking my shirt, but I couldn't stop. It was as if she was pulling me forward. Then she vanished. I spun in place, my heart pounding, but there was nothing but empty desert. When I checked my GPS, the device was frozen, its screen blank. Something wasn't right. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting the desert in hues of red and gold. I stepped inside, craving the relative safety of its metal walls, but the unease followed me. I set my equipment on the counter and reached for my water bottle, only to find it missing. I'd left it right there, next to my notebook, but it was gone. I searched the RV, frustration mounting, and eventually found it outside, propped against the rear tire. The whispers started that night. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Faint voices, speaking a language I couldn't understand, circled the RV. I stayed awake, clutching my flashlight until the whispers faded with the dawn. The next day, I tried to focus on my work, but the landscape seemed to conspire against me. The familiar markers I'd been using to navigate, distant ridges, clusters of boulders, appeared to shift when I wasn't looking. I'd follow a trail, only to find myself back where I started. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. My water supply was limited, and the unrelenting heat was taking its toll. I thought of the stories I'd heard, of hikers who'd wandered into Death Valley and never returned, their bodies swallowed by the desert. I told myself to keep moving, to focus on the data. But then I saw her again. She appeared just beyond the horizon, shimmering in the heat. This time, her features were clearer. Long, flowing hair, pale skin that seemed to glow in the sunlight. She raised a hand, beckoning. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Her lips moved, but no sound reached me. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest, and the ground beneath me seemed to ripple like water. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, as she took a step closer. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and mournful. "This place is not yours." When I woke, I was lying in the shadow of an abandoned settlement. Rusted mining equipment littered the ground, and crumbling buildings leaned precariously against the wind. I didn't remember walking there, but I didn't question it. My only thought was survival. The settlement was eerily intact, as if the desert had frozen it in time. I wandered between the buildings, searching for water or shelter, and stumbled upon a small graveyard. Wooden markers jutted from the sand, their inscriptions weathered but legible. I stopped when I saw my name. Nathan Carter, 1987-2023. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping. I turned and saw her standing at the edge of the graveyard, her eyes hollow and accusing. "You take what is not yours," she said. "You belong to the desert now." The wraith stepped closer, her form flickering like a mirage. The wind howled, carrying her voice. "Leave your tools or stay forever." My camera hung heavy around my neck, its strap digging into my skin. It wasn't just equipment. It was my identity, my lifeline to the world I understood. Without it, I was nothing. But as I looked into her eyes, I saw the truth. The desert didn't want my discoveries, my research. It wanted respect, and I'd come here with nothing but greed. With trembling hands, I unclipped the camera, and set it on the ground. The wraith's form flickered, her expression softening. The whispers faded, replaced by silence. "Go," she said, "and remember." The settlement dissolved behind me as I walked, the desert shifting back to the familiar contours of the playa. My legs felt like lead, my throat dry, but the RV came into view, a beacon of safety in the endless expanse. When I climbed inside, the engine roared to life on the first try. I drove without stopping, the desert blurring into the horizon as the sun dipped low. Weeks later, I published an article about the Racetrack Playa, focusing on the natural phenomena and leaving out the rest. But I never forgot the wraith or the lesson she taught me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers on the wind, calling me back to the desert, and I wonder if I truly escaped, or if she's waiting for me to return. The drive to Silent Hollow felt like a retreat from the world. The dirt road twisted through dense pine forests, the trees towering over me like watchful sentinels. I parked my RV at the edge of the campground, surrounded by nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The quiet was perfect, almost too perfect. This place had a reputation. The locals in town had warned me with hushed voices about the night watcher, a shadowy figure said to guard the hollow from intruders. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but the idea intrigued me. After leaving my job as a private investigator, I'd been searching for something to reignite my curiosity, something to pull me out of the fog of guilt I'd been living in. The legend of Silent Hollow was as good a distraction as any. The first night, I saw the lights. It started just after sunset, as the forest fell into an almost oppressive silence. No birds, no insects, just the faint whisper of the wind moving through the trees. I sat by the RV, sipping coffee, when a flicker of light caught my eye. It was faint, like a distant lantern swinging through the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the glow, stepping carefully over roots and loose rocks. The light moved erratically, weaving between the trees, always just out of reach. I called out, but the sound of my voice felt swallowed by the woods. As I got closer, the light suddenly winked out, leaving me in total darkness. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to move, but the forest was still. Finally, I made my way back to the RV, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the woods. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streaks. But something about it felt wrong. There were no animal tracks, no bird song, nothing to suggest the thriving ecosystem I'd expected. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. As I walked, I noticed an odd pattern. The trees closest to the path were marked with strange scratches, like claw marks. They weren't random. The lines were too precise, forming faint symbols that I didn't recognize. I stopped to take photos, documenting the patterns for later. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was dipping low, and the air had turned colder. That's when I saw the shadow. It was tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't waver, and I felt its gaze even though it had no face. My heart pounded as I stepped toward it, flashlight in hand. But before the beam could touch it, the figure vanished, melting into the trees like smoke. That night, the watcher came closer. I sat inside the RV reviewing the photos I'd taken earlier. The claw marks on the trees were clearer now, their patterns almost geometric. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the lines with my finger, when I heard the tapping. It was soft at first, like the distant tapping of rain, but it grew louder, more deliberate, echoing against the walls of the RV. I turned toward the window, and my stomach dropped. A shadow loomed against the glass. Tall, angular, with glowing, ember-like eyes that burned through the darkness. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair, and grabbed the knife I kept for emergencies. The shadow didn't move. It just watched. When I finally found the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of trees and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The next day, I tried to leave. The woods felt suffocating now, the air heavy and thick. I packed up the RV, started the engine, and turned onto the narrow dirt road that had brought me here. But after driving for what felt like an hour, I realized something was wrong. The road looped back to the campground. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake, taken a wrong turn. But I tried again and again. Each time, I ended up back in the same clearing, the RV facing the same grove of trees. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. The forest didn't want me to leave. As dusk settled over the hollow, the lights appeared again, flickering in the distance like distant stars. This time, I didn't follow them. Instead, I stayed in the RV, watching from the safety of the locked door. The tapping returned, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I closed my eyes and waited for it to stop. By the third day, I was desperate. I decided to follow the lights one last time, hoping they would lead me to answers, or a way out. The forest felt alive now, the trees creaking as if they were leaning closer. The lights flickered ahead, weaving through the darkness like fireflies, drawing me deeper into the woods. I lost track of time as I followed them, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpetus of pine needles. Finally, I emerged into a clearing unlike any I'd seen before. At its center was a stone circle, carved with the same strange symbols I'd seen on the trees. The air was colder here, the silence so absolute it pressed against my ears. The lights hovered above the stones, their glow casting long, wavering shadows. And then the night watcher appeared. It stepped into the clearing without a sound, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It was taller than I'd realized, its limbs impossibly long, its eyes burning with an intensity that made my chest tighten. It raised one arm, pointing toward the center of the stone circle. As I stepped closer, the world around me seemed to shift. The forest blurred, replaced by visions, snapshots of my life, my failures, my guilt. The case I'd botched as a private investigator, the innocent man who'd paid the price for my mistake. The Watcher forced me to confront it all, its ember eyes searing into me as if demanding an explanation. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I can't change the past." The Watcher tilted its head, its gaze unrelenting. The visions shifted, showing me the hollow as it once was, thriving, unspoiled. Then came the destruction. Logging machines, fire, the lights I'd been chasing turning into something darker, hungrier. The Watcher stepped closer, its shadow engulfing me. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of its presence. I don't know how long I knelt there, but eventually the Watcher stepped back. The air grew lighter, the oppressive silence lifting. The lights faded one by one until only darkness remained. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the RV, the forest around me eerily still. I didn't question how I'd gotten there. I packed my things and left, the road ahead finally clear. I've thought about that night every day since. The forest let me go, but it hasn't left me. I still see the watcher's eyes in my dreams, still feel its presence in the shadows, and sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again. The forest at Hollow Branch Creek felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the earthy scent of moss and old wood. Towering trees stretched toward the sky, their branches interlocking like the ribs of some ancient, slumbering beast. I parked my RV in a clearing near the creek, unpacked my camera, and stood for a moment, soaking it in. This place was untouched, sacred, and violated. The scars of human greed were impossible to ignore. Tree stumps dotted the forest floor, raw and jagged, surrounded by discarded tools, chainsaws, axes, and oil-stained tarps. It made my stomach churn. I'd spent decades as a park ranger protecting places like this. After my injury forced me out of the job, I'd felt adrift, like I'd lost my purpose. Now, seeing this destruction, the old anger flared. Who would do this? And why leave their mess behind? I picked up my camera and started documenting the damage. If the logging was illegal, and it had to be, I'd report it. Someone had to hold them accountable. As the sun dipped below the canopy, casting the forest in golden light, I took a deep breath and tried to focus on why I'd come. To reconnect with the wilderness, to find the peace I'd been missing since leaving the ranger service. But Hollow Branch Creek wasn't peaceful. Not really. That night, the forest began to change. I was reviewing the day's photos when I heard the footsteps. Faint at first, like the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, listening, and they stopped. I waited a moment, then stepped outside with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called. My voice echoed, but no one answered. The forest was still, the air cooler than it should have been for early fall. I scanned the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding. The footsteps hadn't sounded like an animal. They'd been too deliberate, too human. But there was no one there. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I followed the creek upstream. The damage from the logging was worse than I'd realized. Whole sections of the forest had been cleared, the ground churned up and muddy. As I climbed over a fallen tree, I noticed something strange. Claw marks on the remaining trunks. Deep, parallel grooves scored into the bark, forming almost deliberate patterns. I knelt, running my fingers over the marks. They were too clean to be natural, too purposeful. A shiver ran down my spine. I snapped a few photos and kept moving. Farther upstream, I found a hollowed-out tree. Its interior was scorched black, as if lightning had struck it, though the surrounding trees were untouched. Inside, buried beneath ash and leaves, was an old axe. The handle was cracked and splintered, the blade rusted, but carved into the wood were the initials WK. The air around the tree was cold, unnaturally so. I left the axe where it was and headed back toward the RV, an unease settling over me that I couldn't explain. That night, I saw the lantern. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of crickets and frogs replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when a faint glow caught my eye. It flickered through the window, moving between the trees like someone carrying a lantern. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was colder than it had been earlier, and the scent of smoke lingered faintly. I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Is someone there?" The lantern flickered, its glow dimming. I followed it toward the creek, my boots crunching softly against the leaves. But when I reached the water, there was nothing. No light, no footprints, just the faint hum of the creek and the oppressive silence of the trees. The following morning, I found my camera pointed at the forest. I was sure I'd left it on the table inside the RV, but there it was, perched on the hood, its lens aimed toward the creek. My hands trembled as I picked it up and reviewed the photos. The last image was a blur of trees, taken at a strange angle, as if the camera had been tilted. But in the corner of the frame, something caught my eye. A figure. It was tall and thin, its body twisted and gnarled like the branches of the surrounding trees. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. My chest tightened. I slammed the camera shut and stuffed it into my bag. I didn't know what I'd seen, if I'd seen anything at all, but I couldn't stay still. I had to move, to do something. I hiked back to the scorched tree, the unease in my chest growing with each step. When I reached it, the axe was gone. The keeper came at dusk. The air grew heavier as the sun sank behind the trees, painting the forest in deep golden light. The creek ran dark and sluggish, its surface rippling like liquid glass. I was standing near the clearing, photographing the last rays of sunlight when I felt it. The ground shuddered beneath my feet, the vibration traveling up my legs and into my chest. The trees groaned, their branches creaking like old wood straining against a storm. And then, in the shadow of the largest oak, I saw it. The keeper. It rose from the earth like it had always been there, its body a mass of twisted branches and moss. Its hollow eyes glowed with an inner fire, and its limbs moved with an unnatural grace, too fluid for something so massive. It stared at me, unmoving, the embers in its gaze burning brighter with each passing second. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Images flashed through my mind, visions of the forest as it once was, lush and vibrant, the creek teeming with life. Then came the destruction. Men with axes and saws, felling trees, tearing up the earth, oil slicks choking the water, fires consuming everything in their path. The keeper took a step toward me, and the vision stopped. I stumbled backward, raising my hands. "I'm not here to hurt this place," I said, my voice trembling. "I swear." It tilted its head, the embers in its eyes flaring. The ground beneath me rippled, and the air grew so cold my breath fogged in front of me. The keeper raised one massive arm, pointing toward the creek. Its gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled with an unspoken command. I understood. I knelt, pulling my camera from my bag. The images I'd taken, the logging scars, the claw marks, the lantern glow, flashed across the screen. They were evidence, proof of what had been done to this place. But I knew, as I looked into the keeper's burning eyes, that it didn't want proof. It wanted respect. With trembling hands, I deleted the photos. One by one, they disappeared, leaving the screen blank. When the last image was gone, the keeper lowered its arm. It watched me for a moment longer, its gaze heavy with something I couldn't name. Then it turned, its body dissolving into the shadows of the trees until there was nothing left but the faint hum of the creek. I left Hollow Branch Creek the next morning. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, its ancient trees standing tall against the rising sun. I felt lighter, though I couldn't say why, as if I'd left something behind that I no longer needed. Months later, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a single photograph. The keeper, standing among the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on the camera. Beneath it was a note written in unfamiliar handwriting. "The forest remembers." When I pulled my RV into Iron Hollow Preserve, I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't looking for anything at all, really, just peace and quiet. The kind of isolation that muffles the world and drowns out the noise in your head. After years as a paramedic, I'd had enough of the noise. The sirens, the screaming, the silence after. The preserve was perfect. No cell service, no other campers, just miles of pine trees and a single dirt road. I parked near a clearing overlooking a narrow valley, the horizon framed by distant cliffs. The air smelled like pine needles and rain-soaked earth. It was the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, I felt it. A weight, like the forest itself was watching. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent the morning hiking the trails, taking in the stillness. The forest was alive with rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. By late afternoon, I'd looped back to the clearing and settled in with a book. That night, I saw the lantern for the first time. I was sitting at the small table in the RV, flipping through pages I wasn't reading, when something outside caught my eye. A faint glow, bobbing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was hikers. The light moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, swaying as if someone were carrying it. But as I watched, it didn't come closer. It didn't move away either. It just hovered, flickering like an old-fashioned lantern. I stared at it for a long time before finally pulling the blinds. The next morning, I overheard hikers talking at the trailhead. "You heard about the lantern keeper, right?" one of them said, his voice low. I stopped, pretending to adjust my pack. "It's just a story," the other replied, though her tone was uncertain. "Yeah? Tell that to the last guy who went looking for it. They found his campsite, but not him." They left before I could ask questions, their words gnawing at the edge of my thoughts. That afternoon, I ventured deeper into the preserve, following a trail that wound through dense pines. The air grew cooler as the trees thickened, and by the time I reached a fork in the path, the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. That's when I saw the footprints. They led off the trail, faint impressions in the damp soil. At first, they looked human. Boots, maybe. But as I followed them, they began to change. The edges blurred, the shape elongating until they looked less like feet and more like something clawed. And then they disappeared altogether. That night, the lantern returned. I'd convinced myself the hikers were just trying to spook each other, but as I sat in the RV, the glow appeared again, brighter this time, closer. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The night was silent, the kind of silence that swallows even your own breathing. The lantern bobbed between the trees, casting long, flickering shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. The light froze. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing happened. Slowly, the lantern began to retreat, its glow fading as it moved deeper into the forest. For reasons I still don't understand, I followed it. The forest felt different at night, the trees closing in around me. The path I'd taken earlier seemed to twist and shift, the landmarks I'd noted gone or changed. The lantern stayed just out of reach, leading me through a maze of shadows. I nearly tripped over the first artifact, a rusted oil lantern, half buried in the dirt. Its glass was cracked, its metal blackened with soot. Farther on, I found a tattered coat hanging from a low branch, its fabric stiff with age. The air grew colder with every step, and a low humming sound began to echo through the trees. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the tower. The fire lookout stood at the edge of a cliff, its silhouette jagged against the night sky. The structure was old, the wood warped and splintered, but the stairs leading up were intact. The lantern floated to the base of the tower, then vanished. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something pushed me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the weight I'd carried for years. The climb was slow, the boards creaking under my weight. At the top, the room was empty except for a single table and a locked cabinet. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of smoke and mildew. On the table lay a journal, its cover charred at the edges. The entries were written in a tight, frantic scrawl. "I've seen the light again. It moves through the trees, always watching. I lit the fires, but they never saw me. They never came. The lantern is mine. It's all I have left." The final entry was smeared with ash. "I'll guide them. They'll follow. They'll burn too." A chill ran through me as the humming grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards. I turned toward the cabinet, my breath hitching. The door was slightly ajar. Inside was a lantern, its glass cracked and its flame flickering weakly. As I reached for it, the room plunged into darkness. When I turned, the lantern keeper was there. Its form was tall and shadowy, its edges flickering like smoke. The lantern it held glowed dimly, casting its face in shifting light. It had no features, just a blank void where its eyes and mouth should have been. I backed away, my legs trembling. "You shouldn't have followed," it said, its voice a hollow rasp. The keeper moved toward me, its lantern swaying. Shadows stretched across the room, twisting into shapes that writhed and screamed. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the keeper. It recoiled, the light scattering its form like ash in the wind. I didn't stop to think. Grabbing the lantern from the cabinet, I ran. The stairs groaned under my weight as the keeper's voice echoed around me, low and guttural. "You can't run. You'll burn too." The moment my feet hit the ground, I doused the lantern with fuel from my pack and lit a match. The flame roared to life, consuming the glass and metal. The keeper appeared at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering wildly. It let out a shriek that pierced the night as the lantern crumbled into ash. And then it was gone. When I stumbled back to the RV, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. The forest felt lighter, the air clearer. But as I drove away, my rearview mirror caught a faint glow flickering between the pines. And I wondered if the lantern keeper was still watching. The desert was quieter than I expected. Out here in White Sands National Park, the dunes stretched endlessly, shimmering white under the midday sun. It was the kind of isolation I'd been looking for, a place where silence reigned and the mysteries felt close enough to touch. I'd parked my RV at the edge of a dirt track, far from the main campsite. My goal was simple: to capture the strange radio signals people had reported hearing in this area for decades. The stories ranged from secret military experiments to aliens. I wasn't chasing little green men. I just wanted to uncover the truth. The first day passed without much to show for it. My equipment, a set of high-powered receivers and an array of antennas, picked up nothing but the usual static. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set up a camera to film the dunes. If there were lights, as some claimed, I wanted proof. That night, the desert came alive. It started faintly, like a whisper in the static. I was sitting outside the RV, staring at the stars, when the receiver crackled. A faint, rhythmic tone pulsed through the speakers, almost musical. I leaned forward, adjusting the dials. The signal grew stronger, resolving into a series of repeating tones. Then, a voice emerged, distorted and distant. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. My first thought was that it had to be a transmission from a nearby military base, but there were no bases here. At least, none that were supposed to exist. "Testing," I muttered into my recorder. "First contact with an unidentified signal. Source unknown." The voice faded, replaced by static. I waited for hours, but it didn't return. The next morning, I met Hank. He was a wiry man in his 50s, sitting on the steps of a ramshackle cabin at the edge of the dunes. I'd come across him while exploring, hoping to find a better spot for my antennas. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "You live out here?" Hank squinted at me, his weathered face unreadable. "What's a city boy doing this far out?" "Looking for radio signals," I said, gesturing to my gear. At that, his expression darkened. "You've heard them, haven't you?" I hesitated. "You know about the signals?" "They've been here a long time," he said. "Longer than me, longer than any of us. They watch and they listen. If you listen back, they'll take you." "Take me where?" I asked, half laughing. Hank didn't smile. "Deeper than you can come back from." That night, I stayed up, waiting for the signal to return. Just past midnight, it came. The same rhythmic tones pulsed through the speakers, but this time they were accompanied by something else. Whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, like the murmuring of a distant crowd. I leaned closer, turning up the volume. "Come closer." The voice was clear now, though distorted, as if coming through a tunnel. My pulse quickened. This was no random transmission. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the dunes. The signal grew stronger as I moved toward the source. My GPS flickered, then went blank, but I pressed on, the voice guiding me. "Almost there." The dunes glowed faintly in the moonlight, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the distance, a flicker of light, too steady to be starlight. My breath hitched as I realized the light was moving, weaving between the dunes. By the time I reached the light, it was gone. I stood alone in the middle of the dunes, the radio silent in my hand. The stars above seemed impossibly far away, and the silence pressed in on me like a weight. Then I saw the first shadow. It was faint, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but as I turned, it solidified. A humanoid figure, featureless and black, standing at the crest of a dune. My flashlight beam passed through it like smoke. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't move, but the signal returned, louder this time, the voice clearer. "You shouldn't have come." The shadow dissolved as I stumbled back toward the RV, heart racing. The next morning, Mara found me. She was a wildlife biologist camping nearby, curious about the antennas I'd set up. I told her about the signal, though I left out the shadow. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're not picking up some old military frequency?" she asked. "That's what I thought at first," I said. "But it's not random, it's intelligent." Mara nodded slowly. "Well, be careful. This place has a reputation. People get lost out here." That evening, Mara joined me as I monitored the equipment. The signal returned, stronger than ever, the tones rising and falling like a melody. "Does that sound deliberate to you?" she asked. Before I could answer, the whispers began again. "Help us. Find us." Mara's eyes widened. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "But it's close." We stepped outside, following the signal into the dunes. The lights appeared again, faint orbs that darted and wove like fireflies. "Is it leading us somewhere?" Mara whispered. "Maybe," I said, though unease gnawed at me. The lights were mesmerizing, but something about them felt wrong, like they were too perfect, too intentional. The deeper we went, the stranger the desert became. The dunes seemed to shift around us, their shapes changing as we moved. My GPS was useless, the screen filled with static. Mara stopped suddenly, pointing at the ground. "Look at this." The sand was marked with spiraling grooves, like something had spun in place. The patterns were intricate, too deliberate to be natural. "What do you think made this?" I asked. "I don't know," Mara said, "but I don't think we're alone." The shadows returned at dusk. They stood at the edges of the dunes, motionless and silent, their forms flickering like static on a screen. Mara grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "We need to go." But the signal grew louder, the voice insistent. "Find the source." I felt the pull, an almost physical compulsion to keep moving. The lights led us to a rusted structure buried in the sand, a relic of some long-abandoned experiment. An antenna jutted from the top, its base partially collapsed. The signal was deafening now, the voice screaming in bursts of static. "Turn it off," Mara shouted, covering her ears. I climbed onto the structure, ripping wires and smashing equipment, the metal groaning under my weight. The shadows closed in, their forms bending and twisting, their faceless heads tilted toward me. With one final blow, the signal cut out. The silence was immediate, suffocating. The shadows froze, then dissolved into the air like smoke. The lights flickered and vanished, leaving only the endless expanse of dunes. Mara and I stumbled back to the RV, shaken but alive. As we drove away the next morning, the desert was eerily quiet. I deleted the recordings, unwilling to relive the voices. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find it again. But as we reached the highway, the radio crackled with static. A faint, melodic tone played, followed by a whisper, "You'll come back." The entrance to the cavern yawned open before me, a dark maw in the heart of Mammoth Cave National Park. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of earth and decay. I adjusted my headlamp and tightened the straps of my pack, glancing back at the sunlight filtering through the trees. It would be the last light I'd see for hours, or so I thought. I'd been spelunking for years, chasing the thrill of exploration, the discovery of something untouched by human hands. This cavern wasn't on any map, a hidden crevice I'd spotted while hiking off trail the day before. It had taken me hours to clear the entrance, shifting rocks and debris, but now it was mine to explore. As I stepped into the darkness, my boots crunching on loose gravel, I felt the familiar rush of excitement mixed with unease. The cave walls seemed to close in around me, their jagged edges glistening with moisture. My headlamp cut through the blackness, casting long shadows that danced as I moved. This was where I belonged, beneath the surface in the silence of the earth. The first hour was uneventful. I crawled through narrow tunnels and descended into larger chambers, my hands brushing against smooth limestone and rough patches of quartz. I marked my path with chalk, ensuring I could find my way back. The deeper I went, the more the cave seemed to change. The walls became smoother, almost polished, and the air grew colder. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct, echoing through the chamber. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound didn't make sense. I was alone. There shouldn't have been anyone down here. Hello? My voice sounded small, swallowed by the cavernous space. The whisper came again, closer this time. It wasn't a word, more like the exhalation of breath, soft and deliberate. I turned slowly, sweeping my headlamp across the chamber, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, though the explanation felt hollow. There was no wind this far underground. I pressed on, but the unease lingered. The whispers continued, faint and sporadic, always just out of reach. My flashlight began to flicker, and I cursed under my breath, tapping it against my palm. The beam steadied, but the shadows seemed darker now, deeper. As I crawled through a narrow tunnel, I saw something strange etched into the rock. It was a symbol, a jagged spiral surrounded by claw-like marks. The edges glowed faintly, a pale green that pulsed like a heartbeat. I reached out to touch it, and a wave of dizziness swept over me. My head swam, and for a moment I thought I heard voices, a cacophony of whispers overlapping, too many to comprehend. I yanked my hand back, stumbling away from the wall. The whispers stopped. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady. It was just my imagination, I told myself, a trick of the light, of fatigue. But as I turned to continue, I noticed something chilling. The chalk marks I'd left on the wall were gone. Panic began to creep in as I retraced my steps. The tunnels twisted in ways I didn't remember, leading me back to chambers I swore I'd left behind. My sense of direction, usually impeccable, was failing me. Every path felt the same: smooth walls, glistening moisture, and the oppressive darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, more distinct. They called my name. "Daniel!" My legs trembled as I turned in a slow circle, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the shadows. The voice was female, soft and mournful, echoing through the chamber like a ghost. My heart raced as I backed away, my pack bumping against the wall. "You shouldn't be here," the voice whispered. "I don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. "Who are you?" The only answer was silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. I stumbled through the tunnels, my flashlight growing dimmer, the air colder. My hands were scraped raw from the rock, my legs shaken with exhaustion. The cavern felt alive, its walls shifting and breathing around me. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was my shadow, cast long by the flickering light, but as I turned, the shadow didn't move. It was a figure, tall and thin, its shape indistinct, like smoke given form. It stood at the edge of the chamber, watching me with eyes that weren't there. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a motion so slow and deliberate that it sent a shiver down my spine. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, and the shadow stepped forward. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping from my hands and clattering to the ground. The light spun wildly, casting erratic beams across the chamber. The figure loomed closer, its form shifting and rippling, and I scrambled away, my back hitting the wall. "You can't leave," the voice said, louder now, filling the chamber. You belong here." I don't know how long I ran. The tunnels blurred around me, their walls pressing in, the air growing thinner. My head swam with fear and exhaustion, the whispers echoing in my mind. Every turn brought me back to the same chamber, the same glowing spiral carved into the wall. I was trapped. Desperation took hold as I searched for a way out. My hands scraped against the rock, feeling for cracks, for anything that could lead to the surface. The whispers grew louder, deafening, and the figure appeared again, blocking the exit. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, grabbing a loose rock and hurling it at the shadow. It passed through the figure, shattering against the wall, and the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. In the stillness, I saw the carvings on the wall more clearly. They weren't random symbols, they were warnings, images of figures like the one stalking me, surrounded by spirals and jagged lines. One carving showed a figure consumed by the spiral, its form disintegrating into the void. My breathing slowed as realization sank in. This place wasn't just a cave, it was a trap, a tomb for those who ventured too far. The shadow moved closer, its form solidifying, and I felt the weight of its gaze. My chest tightened as it reached out a hand, its fingers long and claw-like. "Face it," the voice said, echoing in my mind. Memories flooded back, images of the accident I'd tried to forget. The rescue mission that had gone wrong, the colleague I couldn't save, the guilt I carried, the reason I'd thrown myself into these solitary expeditions. The cavern wasn't just a trap, it was a mirror, forcing me to confront what I'd buried. I don't know where the strength came from, but I stood, my legs shaking. "I won't let you keep me here," I said, my voice steady. The shadow paused, its head tilting again, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The light flared, brighter than it should have, and the shadow recoiled, its form rippling and breaking apart. I turned the beam toward the spiral on the wall, and the carvings began to crack, the glow fading. The ground shuddered beneath me, and a distant rumble echoed through the cavern. The exit. I ran toward the sound, the tunnels collapsing behind me. The air grew fresher, the darkness giving way to faint light. As I scrambled through the narrow passage, I felt the shadow's presence fading, the whispers silenced. When I emerged into the sunlight, I collapsed on the forest floor, gasping for air. The cave entrance was gone, sealed by the rockfall. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the sky, the warmth of the sun on my face. I never told anyone what happened in that cavern. Some places, I realized, weren't meant to be explored. As I drove away in my RV, the whispers lingered in my mind, faint but unrelenting. The shadow hadn't let me go, not completely. The river shouldn't have disappeared. That was the first thing I couldn't explain. When I stepped into Olympic National Park with my GPS, notebook, and water testing gear, I thought I was prepared for anything the wilderness could throw at me. The forest was vast, tangled with moss-covered trees and crisscrossed by rushing streams. But the river I came to study, a pristine, remote artery known for its strange flow patterns, was the heart of my trip. It had taken me years to rebuild my reputation after my last research project fell apart. I'd staked everything on this, finding definitive proof of unexplained water fluctuations. The river was rumored to shrink and swell without rain or snowmelt, as if it had a mind of its own. If I could document it, I'd be vindicated. The hike to my campsite was uneventful, but the air felt heavy, dense with mist and the scent of damp earth. By the time I reached the river, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I knelt by the bank, unpacking my tools. The current was calm, the water clear enough to see the pebbles on the bottom. My first test was simple: measure the flow rate. I set up my instruments and waded in, letting the cool water lap at my boots, and then the river vanished. One moment I was standing ankle-deep in water. The next, I was standing on dry, cracked earth. The air grew still, the sound of rushing water replaced by an eerie silence. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. The river hadn't receded. It had vanished entirely, leaving the riverbed bare and lifeless. I dropped to my knees, running my hands over the cracked soil. It was real. Impossible, but real. And just as suddenly as it had disappeared, the water returned, surging past me as if nothing had happened. Back at camp, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A natural phenomenon, I told myself. Perhaps a sinkhole upstream, but no explanation felt satisfying. I reviewed the footage from my camera, but the lens had fogged up just before the river disappeared. Convenient. The forest was eerily quiet that night. I sat by the fire, my notebook open on my lap, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to the river. I decided to return the next morning and set up more equipment. The next day, as I knelt by the water, something else happened. I glanced down and froze. My reflection was staring back at me, but it wasn't moving. My real face shifted slightly as I tilted my head, but the reflection remained perfectly still, its eyes locked on mine. I stumbled back, splashing into the river. When I looked again, the reflection mimicked my movements, as if nothing had happened. I wasn't alone. The thought gripped me as I followed the river upstream, scanning the banks for clues. I found footprints, human-like but impossibly large. They pressed deep into the muddy ground, leading straight into the water before disappearing. The mist thickened as I continued, the trees crowding closer together. My compass spun uselessly, and my GPS refused to connect. It felt as if the forest itself was conspiring to confuse me. By the time I returned to camp, night had fallen. The firelight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I heard the river's rush in the distance, louder now, like it was angry. The third night was the worst. I woke to the sound of voices, faint and distorted, calling my name. I sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the campsite with my flashlight. The mist reflected the beam back at me, creating a wall of glowing white. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The voices didn't answer, but I caught movement at the edge of the light. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless among the trees. I scrambled to my feet, shining the flashlight directly at it, but the figure vanished. The whispers continued, growing louder as I approached the river. The water churned violently, its surface glinting in the moonlight, and then I saw them. Figures standing in the shallows, their forms distorted by the mist. They moved like reflections on the surface of a rippling pond, shifting and flickering. They turned toward me, their faces blank and smooth. My own reflection stared back from the river, but it wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of mirrored figures watched me, their empty faces distorted into something almost human. I ran. The forest twisted around me, the trees closing in like grasping hands. The whispers followed, accompanied by the sound of rushing water. No matter which direction I turned, the river was there, its currents growing louder and faster. When I stumbled into a clearing, I saw it. Rising from the water was a figure unlike the others. It was humanoid but fluid, its body shifting like a reflection on disturbed water. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice echoed with the power of the river itself. "You exploit what you do not respect," it said, its voice low and resonant. "This land is not yours." "I'm not here to harm anything," I stammered, backing away. "I'm just studying the river." "You take," it said, the water rising around its feet. "Always taken. Leave or stay forever." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced and the rushing water grew deafening. The spirit, if that's what it was, stood motionless, its form towering above me. Its eyes bore into mine, demanding something I couldn't understand. Then I remembered the samples. I reached into my pack, pulling out the vials of water I'd collected from the river. I hesitated, then placed them carefully on the ground. My notes followed, pages of calculations and observations. I didn't know if it would make a difference, but it was all I had to give. The spirit stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, it receded into the water, its form dissolving into ripples. The rushing current softened, and the forest fell silent. The path back to camp was clear, the mist lifting as I walked. My gear was still there, untouched, but I didn't dare stay another night. I packed quickly, my hands trembling, and left the park before dawn. As I drove away, the forest seemed to watch me, its shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. The river, flowing calmly now, glinted in the rearview mirror like a warning. I never published my findings. The footage was corrupted, the data inconclusive. But I wrote an article about respect, about the mysteries of nature, and about the delicate balance we so often take for granted. I didn't mention the spirit or the figures in the mist. Some things, I realized, are better left unexplained. Still, when I'm near a river, I sometimes see flickers of movement in the water, shadows that don't belong, and I wonder if the river remembers me as clearly as I remember I. The air around Devil's Backbone felt heavy, like the weight of a forgotten history pressing down on me. The limestone cliffs loomed above, their jagged edges cutting into the horizon. I parked my RV at a secluded trailhead, the soft crunch of gravel under my tires the only sound. This place was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that calmed you, it was the kind that made your pulse quicken, as if the world were holding its breath. I wasn't here for the peace and quiet, though. I was here for the story. The legend of the forgotten man had drawn me in. A nameless bandit hanged by vigilantes, his body buried in an unmarked grave along the ridge. The locals claimed his spirit wandered the cliffs, restless and vengeful. As a history teacher turned vlogger, I lived for stories like this. They weren't just tales to me, they were windows into the past, ways to connect with the people and places that shaped us. But the warnings from the townsfolk had stayed with me. "Don't wander too far," one had said. "The forgotten man doesn't like company." I'd laughed it off, of course. Ghost stories were good for views, but I didn't believe them. Not really. The first day was uneventful, though the ridge had a way of getting under my skin. The trails were narrow and winding, with sheer drop-offs that made my stomach churn if I got too close. The limestone cliffs gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the gnarled oak trees seemed older than the ridge itself. I spent hours filming the terrain and narrating the story of the forgotten man. The bandit had been part of a gang that terrorized the area in the late 1800s. When the locals finally caught him, they'd hanged him from a tree at the edge of the cliffs, letting his body dangle as a warning to others. According to the legend, His spirit still haunted the ridge, seeking revenge on anyone who trespassed on his land. As I hiked back to the RV, something caught my eye. A pocket watch, rusted and worn, lying on a flat rock near the edge of the trail. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The metal was cold, unnaturally so, and when I opened it, the clock face was frozen at midnight. The air around me seemed to change, growing colder. The usual rustling of the wind through the trees had stopped, leaving an eerie silence. I slipped the watch into my pocket and hurried back to the RV. That night, the whistling began. It started faintly, barely audible over the hum of the RV's generator. I sat at the small table, reviewing the day's footage, when the sound caught my attention. A low, mournful whistle drifting through the still night air. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and scanned the clearing. The light cast long, shifting shadows against the trees, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking the silence. The whistle stopped. I turned to head back inside, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. They were pressed into the dirt, leading from the edge of the clearing to the back of my RV. My flashlight followed the trail, but the prints stopped abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I locked the door behind me that night, the sound of the whistling replaying in my head. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the ridge. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of weather that usually sharpened my senses. But today, everything felt off. The trails I'd marked on my map seemed to shift, leading me in circles. The trees were too still, their gnarled branches casting strange, claw-like shadows on the ground. I came across carvings in the rocks and trees, crudely etched warnings that sent a chill down my spine. "Leave now. Forgotten. You are not welcome." I filmed them for my vlog, trying to convince myself they were just pranks left by bored hikers. But the deeper I went, the heavier the air became, pressing down on me like a physical weight. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I spun around, my heart hammering, but the trail was empty. The sound stopped when I stopped, resumed when I walked. It was like someone, or something, was mirroring my every move. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting, casting the ridge in a fiery glow. I collapsed onto the small bed, my head spinning with unease. That's when I noticed the pocket watch. It was sitting on the table, though I could have sworn I'd left it in my bag. I opened it, and the hands had moved. The watch now read 12:05. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time. It moved around the RV, circling closer. I sat frozen in the darkness, clutching the pocket watch as the sound grew impossibly loud. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, like fingers drumming against the glass, then more insistent. I turned toward the window, and there it was. A shadowy figure stood just outside, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and a noose dangled loosely around its neck. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. The next morning, I tried to leave. I packed up the RV, started the engine, and turned onto the dirt road that led out of the campground. But no matter how far I drove, the road looped back to the same clearing. Each time I found myself staring at the same grove of trees, the same rocky trailhead. Desperation clawed at me. I parked the RV and grabbed my camera, determined to find answers. If the forgotten man wanted to scare me, he'd have to do better than this. I followed the trail again, this time letting the whistling guide me. The sound was louder now, almost deafening, pulling me toward the edge of the cliffs. The trail ended at a gnarled oak tree, its branches twisted like skeletal fingers. A rope dangled from one of the branches, frayed and swaying in the wind, and beneath it stood the forgotten man. He was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his tattered clothes hanging from his skeletal frame. He held the rusted pocket watch in one hand, the other gesturing toward the noose. The air around him shimmered, bending the light like a heat mirage. "You came for a story," he rasped, his voice a hollow whisper. "Now you're part of it." I stumbled back, my heart racing. The forgotten man stepped closer, his movements unnervingly fluid. The noose tightened as if by some invisible force, the rope creaking against the branch. "Wait," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm not here to hurt this place. I just wanted to tell your story." The forgotten man tilted his head, his glowing eyes boring into me. The air grew colder, and the cliff beneath my feet seemed to shift, the ground crumbling dangerously close to the edge. "Your kind always takes," he hissed. "You dig, you exploit, you forget. Leave this place or share my fate." I clutched the pocket watch, its cold metal biting into my palm. Slowly, I knelt and placed it on the ground, bowing my head. "I'll leave," I whispered. "I'll leave it all behind." The forgotten man stared at me for a long moment, his form flickering like a dying flame. Then he turned and walked into the shadows, his figure dissolving into the wind. The noose stopped swaying, the rope falling limp. I didn't waste any time. I returned to the RV, packed up, and drove. This time, the road didn't loop back. The ridge faded into the distance, the whistling carried faintly on the wind. I never posted the footage from Devil's Backbone. Some stories, I realized, aren't meant to be told. Weeks later, a package arrived at my door. Inside was the pocket watch, its hands frozen at midnight, and a note. "Some things are better left forgotten."